So, when a beloved media franchise comes to an end before fans feel like they've had enough, what do? Maybe they'll rewatch or reread bits and pieces as the case may be. Maybe they'll engage in official secondary media like board game, video game tie ins, collectibles, and maybe, just maybe, they'll start indulging in fan fiction. Works that claim to in some way represent the spirit of the original franchise, but without claiming to be canonically part of it. Today, I'd like to ask the question, when a reader is drawn to that secondary media created by secondary creators that claims to be carrying, the torch of the original sources, to what light is the reader actually being drawn? In other words, what about the originals are readers trying to get more of? Do they want to maybe spend more time with the characters? Do they want something that matches the original in terms of its tone or style? Do they want the themes that the original work explored to be looked at in greater depth or maybe from new angles even? Or is it enough to just set a story in the same location and give characters the same names, even if what then happens has basically nothing to do with the original work? Because let's be clear, when we talk about stories in the Yellow Mythos not written by Robert W. Chambers, what we're talking about is fan fiction. It might feel wrong at first to categorize something as fan fiction, especially if it doesn't star like pony characters, but let's not fool ourselves. Stories contained in books like this one, although they are bound physically, sold to you by a reputable press, and feature authors who have published original works, this is work by enjoyers of the original series, fans, that is fictional. So it is fan fiction, just sort of definitionally speaking. As is often the case with fan fiction of really any media property, franchise, series, whatever, the quality of the stories in the sort of canon varies considerably. The Star in Yellow is probably among the best that I have read. That might shock some people, but that is the honest truth. The most common problem that I've encountered with these King in Yellow stories post Chambers is that they really just kind of miss the point of the King in Yellow entirely. They strip him of any specific associations, which just kind of reduces him to like a scary man that makes you go crazy and kills you, not really meaningfully different from Slender Man or Freddy Fazbear. However, there are plenty of entries into the Yellow Mythos that rise to the level of being worthy successors of Chambers' work. And the story that we're going to talk about today, Field Trip by Patrick Freivald, is one such story. Today's story distinguishes itself from the Chambers originals by starring a female protagonist with a rich inner world, and also feels contiguous from Chambers' stories in the way that it shares some of his anxieties about authoritarianism, for example. I'm really, really excited to share this story with y'all today because I don't think it's really been talked about anywhere else online, at least not seriously. I found a paragraph about it nestled in a longer review that was kind of compiling a bunch of short reviews of other King in Yellow stories. And the review was so unhelpful, and it was just like, this story is boring or something like that. And I was like, okay, well, before I get ahead of myself, though, the Lethal Chamber, parentheses, English Club Room, beckons. So let's step into it, shall we? So, unlike other King in Yellow fanfiction that we've already looked at, namely The Star in Yellow, which crossed over the King in Yellow with another media property, and then also borrowed and, reinterpreted certain elements of both in order to create its own thing, and then The Nothing, which is like fanfiction without even really knowing it's fanfiction, that is talking about some of the same fears that are explored in the King in Yellow, and does so using some of the same imagery, but arguably without like explicitly being inspired by the King in Yellow. Today's story, Field Trip, is a direct sequel to an existing story in the Yellow Mythos, that being the first, The Repair of Reputations. If you haven't seen my video on that, it might help, but I'm going to give us a quick summary now so that you don't have to go watch a whole hour-long video just to be able to enjoy this one, which I think ultimately should stand on its own. So, The Repair of Reputations is the first story in Robert W. Chambers' King in Yellow, this little short story collection that I'm using as a coaster right over here, This book contains 10 stories, but only 5 of them really fit into this like contiguous yellow mythos where there is a scary entity called the King in Yellow who comes from maybe beyond space or outside time. And in this universe, there is a play about the King in Yellow with no known author that just sort of appeared spontaneously in the late 1800s. So, about the same time that this book actually came out in the real world. And if you read this play, it either reveals some grand truth to you that like breaks your mind, or makes you think that that's what's happening as a means of just sort of driving you insane and killing you. It's always left ambiguous, and the nuance with which this ambiguity is created, I always feel like I'm not able to do justice in the form of a summary. Because there's all kinds of like very real fears present in The King in Yellow. Robert W. Chambers was Catholic, and that shows up in especially The Repairer of Reputations. He was definitely afraid of governmental overreach. That shows up in multiple stories. He seemed to have an intense anxiety about what it was to be like known as a lover, like known by your partner. And that shows up in 2 stories in particular. And it's really hard to fit all of that into a summary. But in any case, we just need to talk about The Repairer of Reputations, which again is the first story in the collection. So that story is set in 1920. It's set in this alternate America that's very dystopian. We'll see more of it in the story we're actually going to talk about today, so I'll come back to like the specifics of how that America is really scary. The main character is this guy named Hildred Castaigne, who's just been released from an asylum, and while he was in the asylum, he somehow managed to get his hands on the play called The King in Yellow, and it convinced him that he was next in line for the imperial throne of America, which is a thing that, like, we don't know to exist. Like, in this world, America has a president, so Hildred's talking about, like, this imperial throne that he's owed, and it's unclear, again, if the play let him in on some secret that the general populace, and by extension, we don't know about, or if it just made him completely delusional. Hildred has this friend named Mr. Wilde who claims to be incredibly well connected and run this vast blackmail network that could topple all of America and then the world within 48 hours. Hildred and Mr. Wilde kind of hatch this scheme to exile Hildred's cousin Lewis, who's actually in line for the throne before Hildred. So Hildred wants to just make Lewis disappear, whether that means killing him or peacefully convincing him to change his name and move out of town and never be seen again. Ultimately, what happens is Hildred and Mr. Wilde's plan fails. Mr. Wilde is accidentally killed. Hildred is arrested, and that's it. It's pretty probable that Chambers intended for us to read Hildred as a completely unreliable narrator and Mr. Wilde as equally deluded in his beliefs about, this blackmail network that he supposedly runs. But almost all stories that adapt The King in Yellow for modern times just assume that one of those things is right. You'd have a pretty hard time putting together a collection of stories in which The King in Yellow is just in no way real and it's completely made up. And while I can't, really speak to the motivations of the generations now of writers who have been reinterpreting Robert Chambers' work, I think that probably part of the reason they often choose to make, The King in Yellow, at the very least, a real cosmic entity is because it's just more fucking fun. However, while it is in a way, I think, easier to write a story where, the King in Yellow is real and the dimension, Carcosa, that he comes from is also a real place, and there is some grand conspiracy, to set up a next imperial emperor of America who is descended from Carcosan nobility, it's more challenging to then loop those tropey genre fiction trappings back into something that's a little bit more literary, that's designed to do more than just entertain. Because a lot of King in Yellow stories are really comfortable having all of these supernatural elements just be real, but then they don't actually use them to, accomplish anything other than cheap scares, which I would argue is very unlike what Chambers is doing in his original set. But today's story, Field Trip, succeeds in doing exactly that. It removes some of the ambiguity about what is real and what is fake in the original Repairer of Reputations, but then uses that loss of ambiguity to tell a very clear story that has very obvious rhetorical aims without beating it over your head. You'll see what I mean. In any case, that's my little summary of The King in Yellow and the Repairer of Reputations, so let's get into Patrick Freivald's Field Trip. The central question of Field Trip is really, if we assume that the King in Yellow is real and rules the world from sort of behind this cosmic curtain, what sort of person would be politically, emotionally, intellectually aligned with his reign? And the answer is our protagonist, Marie. Now, the story drip feeds us a lot of information that I'm just going to give us outright for the sake of clarity in the summary, but the way that details are sprinkled delicately throughout the story is part of what makes it such a pleasure to read and what made it rewarding to read and reread as I was scripting this video. So here's a bunch of the stuff that if you're reading the story, you would find out gradually right up front. So Marie is this 23-year-old teacher in the midst of an affair with a former student of hers named William, who is now attending college. On the day the story opens, April 13th, 1967, it is the 47th anniversary of Marie's school, the Sophie Germain School, falling to the very bottom of New York's rankings. This deeply shamed, and you could say injured, the reputation of Marie's grandmother, who was then the principal, which prompted her to seek out Mr. Wilde's services. Mr. Wilde promised that he would be able to repair Marie's grandmother's reputation by raising the school back up to the very top of New York's school ranking board, which I keep wanting to call Bachelor Board, but it isn't the Bachelor Board, it's like about schools. But how is this dramatic comeback going to be accomplished? All in due time, dear club member, all in due time. Field Trip opens in bed. And reading Chambers' work, there is this pressurized, barely contained sexuality that is at times uncomfortable to read. So opening this story, Field Trip, post-coitus, feels like an authentic modernizing of Chambers' work. You know, Chambers was writing over 100 years ago in a more prudish time. The sexuality was there, but couldn't always be overt. Now the sexuality can be overt, and so it is. So after finishing up their business, Marie shoos William out of bed, and she hears these church bells and sirens mingling outside, a combination that she snidely calls a, quote, herald of degenerate conflicts to come. And this is just such great characterization in this single line. To Marie, the mingling of these church bells and police sirens outside is representative of this grand struggle between chaos and order, a la Jordan Peterson. And the struggle itself, the fact that there even is a conflict taking place, is to her degenerate, which places her, implicitly in a hierarchy above this degeneracy. The fact that she would label it as such suggests that she would like to think of herself as above it, right? It's almost an insult to her that she should even have to hear about this conflict from a distance. But as Marie is getting out of bed and preparing to head home, we learn that she is somebody who sees prime numbers, and in specific Germain primes, which are a type of prime number that was first described by Sophie Germain, everywhere in her life. Marie sort of implies that she feels some sort of spiritual connection to Sophie Germain, who, though she was never permitted into academia because she was a woman, still managed to, in her private research, come up with some really important contributions to mathematics that not only advanced the field, but then ultimately helped pave the way for women to enter the European Academy as mathematicians. Marie speculates that she, sort of like Germain, is being guided by the King in Yellow in teasing out these arcane truths from the web of reality. And this begs the question, of course, if Sophie Germain discovered all these important formulae that, are still valuable even to us in 2026, what is it that Marie will accomplish or contribute to society? So while William is in the shower, Marie leaves without saying goodbye and goes to her own apartment where she gets ready for the day. As she's heading out the door, she makes sure to grab this envelope that is labeled M. Wilde, and we never learn Mr. Wilde's first name in The Repair of Reputations or in this story, so I'm just going to choose to assume that the M stands for Mr., and his name is actually just Mr. Wilde. On her way to work, Marie happens upon this protest that's taking place in response to a peace treaty the US has recently signed with Vietnam. And if we hoped that this world would be any less nasty than Marie herself, we're going to be disappointed, because she might have had a point when she was talking about there being a lot of degeneracy on the loose, at least a little bit. The protesters are shouting, "Make war" instead of "make peace," which is obviously an inversion of what we would expect from, peace protesters in the 1960s, especially regarding, Vietnam. One protester who becomes particularly frenzied and sort of begins to rush at Marie is then shot and stabbed to death by a cavalryman who has been, deployed to the scene to keep the protesters from getting too crazy. Marie and this cavalryman then make eye contact and wave at each other. And in this really gross moment, Marie gets like turned on by how sexy it was that this guy just shot a protester. So there's like really no good guys in this scene, right? On one hand, we have protesters, but they're advocating for more violence on the global stage. We have police officers that are then killing these protesters in the streets just indiscriminately. And then we have Marie who sees that and is like, yeah, I'm into that. It's really, really fucked up. While she's passing by the protest, Marie also happens, to notice that there's an American flag waving somewhere in the background. And in this universe, the flag has 67 black stars, some of which stand for states like the Greater Incan Empire and Suwannee, which in this interpretation of the King in Yellow was a state that was led by Black Americans that seceded from the US before subsequently becoming a colony. Like the US then violently reconquered it, which is a little bit different from the Repair of Reputations, where we know that Suwannee exists and is seemingly independent from the US, but we don't really know anything else about it or its like relationship to the US, just that it's like there somewhere. Anyway, arriving at the front steps of the school, her workplace, Marie runs into her fiancé, Principal Lassiter. He asks her if she is ready for something, but doesn't specify, what. And from Marie's internal monologue, we can glean that she's recently been placed in charge of some remedial class and that there's something important that they have to do that day. When she doesn't, respond to him, though, Principal Lassiter asks her, sort of out of the blue, if she slept at home the previous night. She says that she didn't, and he tries to, stop and have this argument with her right there about, what the hookup situation is going to be when the two of them get married. And she says, quote, "I will play my part in our lives, but I, like you, belong first and foremost to the Lord of Carcosa." And this is very important, not just for the narrative, but for Marie's characterization, so kind of put a pin in that. Anyway, this understandably weirds Principal Lassiter out, so he's kind of left standing on the steps as she goes into her class, where 17 students are eagerly awaiting her arrival because today they have a field trip to go on. So they say the Pledge of Allegiance, which in this universe, is really scary and talks all about how they love the King in Yellow and how he makes everybody crazy. And she then dismisses the class to the bus, where they don't really walk in like an orderly line. They all just sort of burst out the door. Marie is offended by this. Her more traditional sensibilities are like, oh, my mother and grandmother would never have permitted such behavior from students when they taught in schools. And it was in this moment, every time I read the story, that I was reminded of just what a miserable person Marie is. She would just suck to be around. She's 23 years old and she's already doing this oh, the youth, oh, back in my day, bullshit. It's so off-putting. As Marie is getting ready to follow the kids out the door, Miss Halloran, who is never given a traditional, introduction moment, but who's sort of implied to be the previous lead teacher of the class before Marie was asked to step in, picks up a crate full of the students' lunches and starts to head to the bus as well. But Marie tells her not to bother, and Miss Halloran, sort of timidly is like, oh, well, maybe this time things will be different, right? And Marie just shrugs that off, saying, "We all have our role to play. Be thankful you've been chosen for the third act." So they all go get on the bus and they head off to Washington Square Park, where Marie leads the group on this little tour. And there's lots of cute little interactions with the kids during this scene. So even though Marie kind of resents them because they're in the remedial class and she's been asked to lead this low-ranking class, to us, the reader, and even to her almost at times, they're kind of charming, or at least I thought so. One of the places they stop at is a statue of this thing called the Phantom of Truth, which is an entity, or it might even just be a concept that's mentioned a couple of times in the original King in Yellow stories. It's never formally explained, which has led it to be one of the aspects of the King in Yellow that often gets just dropped from these reinterpretations. Or if it does get mentioned, it becomes something totally unrecognizable, because again, in the original stories, it basically was just a phrase. So in this continuity, it is some kind of ever-shifting mass that once you have seen it, you find yourself often thinking about it, but it's impossible to picture what it looked like. which is obviously, like quite thematically loaded, right? Because if it's a phantom of truth and you can never fully grasp it, you can't even remember it, it kind of implies that in this world that is ruled by the King in Yellow, truth is nothing but a phantom. It can never really be known, and even if you were to know it, it would have changed by the time that you were able to, match up your knowing with reality, which is very creepy. The last place they go on their tour is the Lethal Chamber, which is a little building from the Repair of Reputations that I didn't mention in my summary because I wanted to save it for now, and also because it doesn't really do anything in that story. It's just kind of there as a symbol of how morally bankrupt America has become. This chamber is sort of like this ornate marble neoclassical construction with a big metal door that if you walk into it, you just die. When it first shows up in the Repair of Reputations, a government official is announcing, that anyone who is, say, too sick, I think he says too despairing, who has no hope any longer, can go and just... Conversations of, ethical euthanasia aside, it's fairly clear that in the Repair of Reputations, Chambers, again, a Catholic, intended for us to see this as a really horrible policy that only a government that wanted its most vulnerable populations to self-annihilate would implement. In any case, the chamber is inscribed with the words, "The day has dawned, the day has dawned," in honor of Hildred Castaigne, who Marie tells the kids was treated as insane in his own time, but is now nationally recognized as basically a prophet. Marie asks the class why this particular phrase, "the day has dawned," has been inscribed here on the chamber, and a particular female student is able to answer, although she's pretty timid about it. And Marie laments, inwardly at least, how even in current year, smart women are taught to be bashful, which undercuts their own authority and makes them seem less intelligent than they actually are. Marie thanks the student for her answer, and she says that the purpose of lethal chambers were partially to help free up resources that otherwise would go to the ill, the elderly, the homeless, and other people that are basically considered by the government to be unwise investments. Instead, such people are just sort of granted the opportunity to basically fast track their embrace of the King in Yellow. At least that is how Marie thinks of it and tells us to think of it. Then Marie asks the kids, "Who's first?" and opens the door, and one by one, she ushers them inside, followed finally by Mrs. Halloran. And then she closes the door and then reads the letter in the envelope from Mr. Wilde aloud. It says, "Eunice d'Entremont, headmistress, New York School 491, called July 11th. Reputation damaged at her workplace. Reputation to be repaired April 13th, 1967. Retainer, $800. This is a moment that, in summary, it's kind of hard to convey the suspense that has successfully been built up, but it's like a mic drop moment. It's like, holy shit, I can't believe that just happened. Another touch that I liked, is that all of the kids basically are named as they go into the chamber one by one, which creates this really horrifying litany. Some of them we didn't even know before this. They had been mentioned maybe not by name, but getting this sequence of child after child after child being ushered into the lethal chamber is absolutely harrowing. The story's not quite over yet, though, because we then cut over to Marie back in bed with William, and he's trying to kind of make moves on her, but she's really not having it. He says that he received a call earlier that day from Mr. Lassiter that one of the kids that was sent into the chamber was his brother. And interestingly, William is not infuriated with Marie in this moment. He's like trying to get her turned on. And then this is just like a casual bit of conversation that he works in. He very, very lightly criticizes Marie for not, making an offer to tutor his younger brother to try to get his grades up so that maybe he would be taken out of the remedial class. But Marie is like very easily able to argue that like, no, he didn't have, quote, the aptitude according to, quote, the tests. And so William just lets it drop. And obviously, the consequences of not having the aptitude on the tests are incredibly dystopian, but the way that Marie is talking is really not all that different from the kinds of things teachers were saying back when I was in elementary school, like during the peak of the standardized testing area. So hearing this language applied to this really horrific setting, I found really effectively horrifying. So as Marie is, lying in bed, ignoring William, she thinks to herself, finally, with the disposal of these children, the Sophie Germain School, which 47 years ago fell to the lowest ranking in New York, has risen again to the top. Marie falls asleep. That night, she dreams of dancing among the Hyades, which are a constellation that's frequently mentioned in The King in Yellow, alongside the king himself. And as she watches the twin suns sink behind the basin of the Lake of Holly, which is also a location that's frequently mentioned in The King in Yellow, she thinks to herself, the day has come. Something that I want to make sure that we're all kind of on the same page about before I pivot fully into the analysis section is that it's super cool the way that Marie's character arc in this story really mirrors Hildred's character arc in The Repairer of Reputations. There's this scene in The Repairer of Reputations where Hildred is talking to another character about his ambition to become the Imperial Lord of America. And he says, and eventually it will secure the happiness of the whole world. The other character responds, and incidentally your own happiness and prosperity as well as Mr. Wilde's? To which Hildred responds, exactly. I smiled, but I could have throttled him for taking that tone. So here, Hildred sort of tries to justify his desire to rule America by suggesting that, it just so happens to also be in everyone's best interest. And that's a belief that is pretty clearly shared by Marie, as we're going to see more of in just a minute. So I've already made kind of a big deal, maybe even too big of a deal, out of the fact that I think Field Trip is really a cut above many of the other Yellow Mythos stories. But what specifically makes Field Trip so much better than its spurned and desecrated brethren? So for instance, Field Trip has some self-confidence on the level of the prose. For example, Marie isn't even named until her fiancé calls out to her on the school steps, which is a couple of pages into the story. And I see this as a sign of Field Trip correctly believing itself to be engaging enough that it can withhold information until it naturally, organically comes up in the story. In trusting itself, Field Trip also trusts us as readers, at least in my opinion. By the time Marie and Mr. Lassiter meet on the steps, Marie has already mentioned Mr. Lassiter once previously using his full name, Colin Lassiter, but rather than, wasting time re-clarifying that this is the same guy, the story just goes, oh, it was Mr. Lassiter, the principal, on the steps. And they begin speaking to each other in ways that just make it clear that, yes, this is her fiancé, Colin. It can be really easy to take these details, the withholding of a name and then the expecting us to connect the dots about the name of a second person for granted. But to me, these are really good signs when I'm reading a story when these things happen. Because what it often means is that we're dealing with an attentive writer, somebody who is tracking what information has been given to the reader, how long ago, in what order to deliver details, and that's somebody that you can usually trust to tell you a story that's worth reading. This is a really, really far cry from other stuff that we've discussed here at Club, for example, Skyshade, where characters like Baron, the blacksmith, are never properly introduced and then treated as though they have been, or language is carelessly reused, as in the case of that one time the shuriken metaphor is repeated within a couple of pages. And one might wonder why I am giving this story so much credit for getting these very basic things right and for just sort of not doing things that are bad. But in my opinion, we really can't take these things for granted anymore. These signs of skillful craftsmanship in fiction are increasingly rare in popular literature, and so when I see them, I'm going to praise them. Something else that Field Trip does better than 90% of other King in Yellow stories that I've read is how it incorporates elements from the original King in Yellow stories. It's very tasteful and very intentional about it in a way that I really appreciate. I think most prominently, it really expands on the use of the lethal chamber, which, as I mentioned, really only comes up as sort of a footnote, a piece of supporting evidence for how evil America has become in The Repair of Reputations, where in this story, it features in the climax, actually facilitates the climax. It becomes not just an example of how bad America is, but a much more active vector of the problem. Like, it has become fully integrated in society, which is also really cool, right? Because we've moved almost 50 years into the future, and in the Repair of Reputations, the lethal chamber had just been opened, and we see like two people sort of in the background, tentatively use it. But now it's become systematized. It's part of how education systems are operated. And I think that that's really interesting. The story also has some restraint, though. It really features the lethal chamber, but it knows how to hold back. The play, The King in Yellow, the evil book that drives you crazy, it doesn't appear in the narrative at all. It's mentioned, of course, but that's just because it kind of has to be. It doesn't actually show up, which is a restraint that a lot of other King in Yellow stories just unfortunately don't seem to be able to show. There's one particular phrase from Robert Chambers' The Yellow Sign that pops up in almost every single King in Yellow story. And it's used in The Yellow Sign to describe the flesh and countenance of this one church night watchman who freaks out the main character. This phrase, coffin worm, will be tortured into random sentences in more modern King in Yellow reinterpretations. And once you start seeing it, you can't stop seeing it. It works in Field Trip because there is a guy who guards the entrance to the lethal chamber. He is a guard. The church watchman in The Yellow Sign was a guard. Both are described as having this coffin worm-like flesh. This is like a tasteful homage. Some of the other stuff we see is not. I don't want to call anybody out right now. If I'm going to really criticize somebody, I'll dedicate a whole video to it. But let it be known that throwing the phrase coffin worm into your King in Yellow story is not a way to instantly validate it as part of the canon. It's so clearly there so much of the time just to get us to soy jack at it, which is so annoying as a reader because I am reading these King in Yellow spin-offs because I'm already soy jacking. I see the thing and I recognize the thing and I am excited by my recognition of the thing. I'm already soy jacking. You don't need to put words in there that I'll recognize just so I'll be oh, even more. It's oh my god, okay. One final thing I want to note that this story does really well that isn't specifically related to other King in Yellow stories, but was just a thing that I thought was cool, is the way that Freivald uses character names symbolically, but without it becoming gimmicky and sort of intrusive. So Maria's last name is d'Armont, which translates into English roughly as of soldiers, and that will make sense sort of shortly. Marie's grandmother's last name, on the other hand, is d'Entremont, which means from between the mountains. And in Ambrose Bierce's short story Haida the Shepherd, which inspired Chambers to write The King in Yellow, the shrine of this entity named Hastur lives between two mountains. And in many King in Yellow reinterpretations, Hastur and the King in Yellow will be sort of equivocated. They'll be treated as different faces of the same entity. There's even a Yu-Gi-Oh card where Hastur and the King in Yellow are given this sort of equivocation treatment. Anyway, this could be a nod to Marie being of Carcosan lineage in the same way that, Hildred believed that he was descended from Carcosa. Of course, both names are also French, which is a nice nod to the bicoastal nature of Chambers' original stories, many of which take place partially or wholly in France. Meanwhile, there's this sculptor who's named really briefly Arne Clerk, who helped build the lethal chamber in this continuity. His names mean eagle and scribe, respectively, which is perhaps a nod to the fact that, he wrote or inscribed the text on this symbol of patriotic self-annihilation that is the lethal chamber. But actually, I know for a fact that that is not the case, because I reached out to the author of Field Trip, and he had this to say. Arne Clerk's name is just kind of a personal Easter egg for myself, which I didn't expect anyone else to get. Arne was, at the time I was writing the story, the first name of the United States Secretary of Education, Arne Duncan, and it probably doesn't need saying that he was a monstrously inept idiot overseeing radically stupid changes to the education system developed by well-meaning idiots who didn't bother to consult actual teachers or child development specialists, because that describes all DOE-Ed secretaries since the inception of the department. Damn. I have to admit that I don't know that much about Arne's policies from a pedagogical perspective. I mean, I was able to, read a bit about them on Wikipedia. But, speaking as somebody who actually has firsthand experience with the effects of those policies, having grown up in public school at the time when Arne was an influential figure, not that I knew that, I can say anecdotally that all of the standardized tests that his policies helped to create made the end of every school year pretty pronouncedly miserable. And it led to a lot of lessons where it was really clear that teachers were teaching to the test, as they say. They were clearly trying to prepare us for stuff not that they thought was interesting or useful or, God forbid, spiritually nourishing. It was stuff that they were pretty sure would be on the test and would help guarantee their salary, which I hope it doesn't sound like I'm laying that at the teachers' feet. Teachers in the state that I grew up in were disgustingly and are disgustingly underpaid. So they were just trying to survive. But it's really sad that, that our education was geared so much towards being able to bubble in the right combination of letters on a bubble sheet rather than, preparing us for real life or for higher education or whatever. I don't really know how to conclude this section, but Arn worked under Obama, so I guess I'll just say, thanks, Obama. So I went back and forth about how to open this analysis section of the video, and while there are other things that I definitely would have preferred to start with, I decided that I had to begin with something that, were I watching the video, I would probably want to see addressed as soon as possible. Some of you might have picked up on this, but what's going on with Marie's relationship to William, right? I have pretty mixed feelings about this relationship, and while I think that the story does want them to be mixed, I'm not really sure that they're mixed in the way that the story wants. So to cut to the chase, the story leaves it kind of ambiguous as to whether or not William was groomed by Marie. And I think that that's a mistake. I'll just say it frankly. I think that it is a mistake to leave that ambiguous. Because even without the concept of grooming entering the story, the relationship is weird and uncomfortable and thereby would serve the story's purposes. See, for me, the relationship between Marie and William is just one manifestation of this broader character trait that she has. One that we'll talk about in a moment, which is her fetishization of authority. As William's former teacher and also current tutor, as the soon-to-be wife as one of the top-ranked K-12 schools in New York, Marie has power over William, and this, for me, explains why she continues to stay with him, despite not really seeming to actually like him at all. See, we never really get to see Marie and William enjoy each other's company, and to me that leads me to think that they don't enjoy each other's company. During their brief interaction in the opening scene, Marie calls him lazy in her internal monologue. She scolds him, albeit a little bit playfully, but still scolds him out of bed. She admires his ass, and then she leaves without saying goodbye. Now, I've never had an affair, so I'll leave it to the affair havers to sound off in the comments, but this sounds like it might, at best, satiate one's immediate sexual urges. It doesn't really sound like something that would lead to, emotional fulfillment. Then at the very end of the story, while Marie and William cuddle in bed, she says this: "He shifted, spooning against me, arm under my neck, the warmth of his body unpleasant in the humid apartment." And then later, "William's fingers tickled my thigh through the sheet, an annoyance he likely thought titillating." Knowing other things that we know about Marie, I just don't think she would be doing this if she wasn't getting a gratifying sense of control out of it. Now, to be clear, the story does take a couple of steps to try to suggest that Marie began pursuing William after he had already graduated, but it still leaves it open to interpretation, which again, I think it probably shouldn't do. So in the final scene of the story, Marie says, "In 1967, any unmarried woman might live down an affair, engaged or no, but not with a former student, and not one just graduated." So for me, although the phrase "with a former student" seems to suggest that the affair did begin after William graduated, even that raises the question of how long Marie had her eye on William. And frankly, I find it all but impossible to imagine she didn't at least think of pursuing him while he was still her student. And to me, just the fact that she would be looking at her students that way, or one of her students even, is really mortifying enough. Now, in addition to the sort of very subtle guardrails that the story sets up to guide us away from the suggestion that William was groomed, when I asked Freivald about Marie and William's relationship, he described it in terms that make it pretty clear to me that he absolutely did not intend for us to read this as a story about grooming. Now, I didn't ask him directly whether or not William was groomed, because I thought it provided for a more rewarding, like, intellectual exercise to try to figure it out for myself based on what only the text gives us. I still wanted to ask Freivald some questions, just about things that I couldn't figure out, like what was going on with Arne Clark's name, but I didn't want him to interpret the story for me. But anyway, here's how he described Marie and William's relationship. He said, "I knew I wanted the protagonist to be a female teacher living in a manner that would be considered decadent or inappropriate by the standards of her fictional era, in a bit of homage to Mr. Scott and Tessie from The Yellow Sign. And frankly, it's just unthinkable to me that he would talk about their relationship this way if Marie was grooming William. Therefore, by process of elimination, William must not have been Marie's victim, at least not in, that legal sense." So we talked about William and Marie. Let's talk about Sophie and Marie. I mentioned in my summary that Marie is really obsessed with Sophie Germain and Germain primes, which again are just a type of prime number, don't worry about it. The date on which the story takes place is made up of these Germain primes. Marie's age is a Germain prime, you get it. I think it's pretty clear that Marie sees this parallel between herself and Sophie Germain, and Marie's take seems to be that, like Germain, she is a woman who is resisting a system that devalues her, one who will one day be as honored as Germain is. But this parallel is pretty obviously diluted, and I think for two reasons. Reason number one, Marie's effect on society is subtractive rather than additive. If you'll forgive the mouth pun, Marie seems to see an equivalence between her sending these children into the lethal chamber, thus bringing the school that she helps to run back to the top of the rankings, and Germain's work on prime numbers. These are, in Marie's mind, both noble, difficult services to society that go underappreciated. But that Marie is wrong should be, self-explanatory, right? But even if we assume that she is right, the equivocation, it still fails. Removing a problem in quotes, is not the same as creating any kind of solution. Germain contributed to humanity's collective knowledge, creating formulae and tools that mathematicians can and use even into the present day in fields like cryptography, for example. But Marie hasn't created anything. All she's actually done is enact a solution prescribed to her by the very system that she is allegedly resisting. The second reason that this parallel is obviously all in Marie's head is that Marie is not an aspirational figure in the way that Germain is. Though she never states it outright, Marie implies that her actions have this aspirational quality. That like Germain, someday people will look back on Marie as a woman that other women can emulate. She implies this a little bit more directly when she says to her fiancé, Mr. Lassiter, that though she may not be, quote, burning her bra with the protesters, she's going to continue to have affairs even after marriage in defiance of these traditional expectations that she needs to, quote, serve her husband. Marie frames this as a kind of radical self-liberation. And although Mr. Lassiter is not a nice guy, and their marriage probably would not be a happy one, even if Marie were to be monogamous, what she's doing is pursuing self-gratification. This is not a noble act that she is undertaking. As much as Marie might try to gaslight the reader, and try as she does, into thinking that what she's doing is brave or rebellious, she's a bootlicker at heart. One of the places that this becomes the most obvious for me is in her response to the soldier that she sees stab and gun down a protester. She gets aroused by this embodiment of authoritarian power. Another place that we can see Marie sort of fetishizing these authoritarian systems is when she sends the children into the lethal chamber, right? While she may be avenging her grandmother, who is a woman, she's also acting as an agent of the state. But there's even an occurrence within this occurrence that is really, for me, the final nail in the studded boot that Marie has halfway down her throat. And that is when she ushers a female student into the chamber who, she has just implied, isn't in the remedial class because she is dumb like the other kids, but rather because she simply lacks confidence. And that she lacks that confidence because of the socialization that she has experienced as a young woman. Socialization of which Marie herself is critical. In this moment, like Marie as a teacher, as, like an ally of women, and in many moments previous to this, could have done something, could have actually taken some kind of action to assist this young woman who is being wrongly treated by the system. But instead, she opts to do what the state prescribes and just annihilates her. In all of this, we also have to remember that these ambitions, repairing her grandmother's reputation, seeing the school rise back up in prestige, and of course, advancing her own career in the process, these are all secondary ambitions to what Marie truly wants, which is to be a literal or figurative consort to the King in Yellow, something she states explicitly in her internal narration, something we also see in her dream at the end of the story, where she is dancing alongside him. And this desire has not just narrative weight, but also thematic weight, right? The king is sort of the embodiment of power beyond power. And Marie is somebody who is in love with that power. She has power over William, and that seems to be the only part of their relationship in which she delights. She has power over her former co-teacher, Miss Halloran, who she treats with disrespect the few times that we actually see them interact in the story. She has power over Principal Lassiter, who she flaunts her extramarital affairs over, and she imagines that someday her legacy as a servant of the king will grant her a kind of symbolic power over broader society. The word like feminist is kind of hovering around how I'm talking about Marie's self-perception. But if Marie is any kind of feminist at all, she's definitely a girl boss feminist. She is the type whose primary concern is ultimately just her personal flourishing. She doesn't want to abolish any systems that are oppressing her and people like her. She just wants to be able to succeed within them. And the sad irony of this story, I mean, it is kind of hard to feel bad for her after all this, but the conceptually sad irony of this story is that in this pursuit of power, Marie doesn't even really better her own circumstances hardly at all. I mean, plenty of power-hungry people in the real world could at least justify their actions by saying that what they're doing is in some way improving the lives of them or the people that they purport to care about. But Marie doesn't even have that. She ends the story just as unhappy as she begins it, with her consortdom to the king still just a dream, and with a really unhappy marriage on the horizon. And I think that that's meant to signify that for people like Marie, there really is no happy ending, not ultimately. Either she spends her whole life perpetually reaching for this goal, becoming the figurative or literal queen consort to the king in yellow, or she does get it, and then she's just going to realize that it isn't enough. Because, like basically everybody that seeks power, Marie is ultimately cucked. She's cucked by her own desire for proximity to ever greater authority. I want to close out my analysis section with this little detail, almost little to the point of being throwaway, that Marie says to Miss Halloran when they're getting ready to head out to the lethal chamber. I read it during my summary, and it goes, "We all have our role to play. Be thankful you've been chosen for the third act." Not only is this, pretty tantalizing the first time you read it, not knowing what's about to happen, but it actually recontextualizes, the real world as contiguous from The King in Yellow, the play, within the context of the story. The book, as we know it, is a play in 2 acts, but Marie suggests that the play continues beyond itself in some literal or metaphorical sense into a 3rd act that takes place in external reality. This is really horrific in a way that I think is authentically King in Yellow, because I don't know about y'all, but I always wondered why the play was specifically 2 acts. I reached out to a couple of theater friends a while back, and one of them said that the beginning of the second act, I should say, is often marked with a pretty pronounced tone shift, or like the beginning of a dramatic tone shift. And that makes sense, because in Robert Chambers' original stories, the first act of The King in Yellow is relatively benign, but once you turn the page over into the second act, it starts to barrage you with these secrets that break your mind and or enlighten you in some way. I love this idea that the 3rd act is canonically like what happens afterward, that all along, even one's reading of the first 2 acts were a part of the 3rd act that was all designed by the king, this master director creating this cosmic production. It's metafictional in the sense that if the real world is also part of the play, then the play exists within itself and it references itself and it becomes recursive and really difficult to even fathom because the play no longer has any origin. Suddenly it's almost this like necessary and self-causing part of reality that should be logically impossible, and yet it exists. It breaks the rules that we understand to govern how the world functions, and yet it's there, almost in defiance of our knowledge. This is at the very heart of The King in Yellow as like a franchise, if you want to call it that, I think. Fundamentally, this is a series of stories about things that cannot be understood, that definitionally we cannot understand, and yet are. Think of it this way. To claim to understand how the play can seem to demand and realize its own existence is to argue in favor of circular reasoning as a way of arriving at truth, which is just, it's fallacious. And yet, again, there the book is. It is undeniably present, even if all of the tools that we have as people to evaluate the world can't account for it. And I think that this is why the protesters in Field Trip are being gunned down by the police, even as they cry out for more slaughter. This is why the president has entered into a peace accord with Vietnam, even at the same time that we have these confirmed instances of the US expanding its colonial rule. Marie herself explains these apparent paradoxes like this. Nothing would stop the global dominion of the Yellow King. The war in Vietnam had ended as soon as it had started, the Tsarists giving control with a kiss of approval. That I disapproved, that I didn't understand, meant nothing, less than nothing. Had Casilda's confusion brought the King in Yellow anything but amusement? So, too, it was not the protesters' part to question, but to obey, and sheer folly that they didn't. It doesn't matter that we don't, or maybe can't, understand the King in Yellow's designs, that they claim to make sense, and yet would seem to act in opposition to themselves. The King does what he does despite us, and perhaps even to spite us, to continually remind us of our own limits as human beings. I asked at the beginning of my summary to what kind of person service to the King in Yellow might be appealing, and I think we have our answer. As I said, our answer is Marie. Marie, who would sacrifice literally everything, even thought itself, in order to gain an inch of nearness to this power that may not even know and definitely doesn't care who she even is.